We are in 2 Kings 5. If I seem a bit frazzled, it's because I am. No, I'm just kidding. I dropped my Bible on the way in, and anyone who knows me and my Bible, I'm very meticulous and particular about it, and when it is dropped, I can't function until I put every page back the way it was, and all of those things. But I think I got them all in time to teach, so otherwise we'd have been waiting a little longer. So we're looking at, in this context, Elisha is becoming the new Elijah, and this is in a greater context that began in 1 Kings 17, and will go all the way through 2 Kings chapter 8, where it's kind of the kings versus the prophets. They kind of have some animosity. Well, the kings have animosity toward the prophet. The prophet doesn't have animosity toward the king so much. And so that's what this section is really about, and it covers the ministries of Elijah and Elisha in the process. And so last week we looked at the miracle of the healing of Naaman, and we're actually still kind of in the middle of that story. In verse 15 is where we're going to pick up, and then hopefully we'll be able to get through that and the first 7 verses of chapter 6 and stop there, because that kind of ends the miracle clusters that we've been talking about, where you've got this long section where Elisha is getting miracle, 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 and confirming things about him being the new Elijah. And so, and remember also that, like we said, that miracles come in clusters. They're not, the way people sometimes think about miracles is that it makes them almost not a miracle. It makes them very common. The very fact, one of the elements that is involved with miraculous is that it is uncommon. It's not the only element, but that's one element. And so if you have them being performed every time you turn around, they're always in great moments. In the Old Testament, they came in 2 major segments. One was the Exodus from Egypt, where you had the 10 plagues, and then the wilderness wanderings era. And then they came again during the days of Elijah and Elisha, and they'll come a third time in the days of Jesus in his ministry and the apostles, and then, of course, they cease. So they're not happening very often. And in this one, in this section of miracles, Elijah and Elisha are confirming who they are in order to draw the people back to God. It's a time of restoration. So we left off, we'll read verse 14 just to remind. It says, "So he, that is Naaman, went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God," that's Elisha, "and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean." Okay, so you remember he was upset because it didn't go the way he thought it should go, and then his servants talked some sense into him. And that's the other, when you see that his flesh is restored like that of a little child, obviously he's using simile, like or as a comparison, different from a metaphor who doesn't use like or as. But that's the thing about genuine miracles. A lot of counterfeit miracles, they aren't, one of the things that they lack is the complete reversal. When miracles were performed, especially on people with health issues, not only was the process stopped, but it was reversed to a perfect state. Okay? It wasn't like Jesus just stopped the leprosy from spreading. It wasn't like on this occasion he just cured the leprosy. He not only cured the leprosy, he restores his skin back to where it's smooth as can be. And so that's one of the markers of authenticity when it comes to miracles. So in response to that, you remember he goes away angry the first time, but now in verse 15, it says, "Then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and came and stood before him, and he said, Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So accept now a present from your servant." And so when in the first half we see Naaman get cleansed physically, his health, he gets his skin back. But what we're going to see now is that he's converted. And this is just the first indicator of that. We're going to run into a couple of more. But when he makes the statement that says, I know there is no God but the God in Israel, you have to understand, in an area where polytheism or henotheism is probably the better term than polytheism. A lot of polytheism, the idea of multiple, and then theism, God. And so a lot of people think of polytheism. Really, it was more like henotheism. And henotheism is where you have basically kind of like a pyramid of gods. You have your God that you set at the top, and then you worship all of the other ones beneath. You have the one you think is the greatest, and then you worship all of the others. And that was a pretty common thought. I don't know how common it is today, but I know it was in Old Testament times and New Testament times. And so for him to say there's only one God and he's the God in Israel, he's been changed. He has seen something and experienced something that only God could do. So, and furthermore, by the way, it shows you also the way Jesus will use it in Luke chapter 4, that he outshines the Israelites. The 10 northern tribes have done what? Who are they worshiping? Baal, whoever they want to. Baal is the main god. And now you have an Israelite, you have a Gentile who's worshiping the Israelite God. As a matter of fact, Jeremiah in his prophecy will say, look around to all the other nations of the world. They serve gods that don't exist, and they are so loyal to them, they have never left them. Yet I am God, and I exist, and I'm your God, and you're leaving me. So your treachery is something that's even looked down upon by the people in the Gentile world. And so he's outshining the Israelites. The same way when you look at the book of Jonah, and you see Jonah's interaction with the Gentiles, first with the sailors on the sea, and then with the Ninevites in the city. Every time you see those interactions, the Gentiles outshine the prophet of God. They behave in ways that are more godly than Jonah does. And so that's something that I think is, it's important that we keep in mind. You know, it's a bad thing if a person in the world is more ethical than the people who belong to God. It is a very bad and sad thing when people in the world are more ethical than the people who belong to God. That should not be so. And that's nothing against them in the world. It's just, it reflects poorly upon us. Then in verse 16, it says, but he said, as the Lord lives before whom I stand, I will receive none. That is, this is Elisha's response to the offer. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. And so he wants to give a gift in exchange, or not exchange, may not be the right word, in appreciation for what has been done for him. Now, Elisha won't have any of it, even though he urges him to take it. So why does Elisha refuse it? We've already talked about however much money that he brought with him initially to try and buy him off was pretty significant. Okay? So, and what we're going to see actually in chapter 6 is that the schools of the prophets could use some money. So why doesn't he take it? Okay? He doesn't want them thinking that this is for sale. What I've given you is not for sale. It's not like this transaction where you give God money and God will give you basically prosperity gospel, where you give God money and God will give you this in exchange. It's one of the main reasons why Paul refused to take money from anybody. Pretty much. Philippi supported him and he would take some on occasion. But he would not take money because his main motivation was, he said, I'm not going to let anybody say that I'm preaching for money. Now, it's interesting. People say, well, more people should be like him. Well, what's also interesting is that same apostle also argued in 1 Corinthians 9 that you should pay them. Okay? But there are certain situations like this one where if you take that, it looks like the gospel is for sale or it's transactional. And that's not something that we want to happen, okay? It's another reason why in the church, we primarily pay for everything out of a treasury. We don't ask people outside to support things that we do very often. I'm not saying there's no circumstance where that wouldn't be acceptable. I'm saying on the whole, we try and foot that, okay? Part of the reason why is because we need people to understand we're not interested in their money. We're not interested in what they can bring us. We're interested in helping them. As a matter of fact, one of my teachers actually came to faith in Christ for the very reason that he would, on Sunday mornings before he became a Christian, would sit and listen to radio shows back to back to back to back. And he began to notice that the only group that would never ask for money were the churches of Christ. So we need to make sure, because there are certainly plenty of times when Elisha could have taken this gift and it would have been perfectly acceptable, but there's nothing wrong with it. But there are other times where he's trying to make a point and it would have been wrong to take it. So that sets the background for what we're going to see a little bit later. Now, in verse 17, Naaman says, okay, if you won't take the money, please let there be given to your servant 2 mule loads of earth or dirt. For from now on, your servant will not offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any god but the Lord. So what did he basically ask for? What's he going to do? Okay, start here. What did he ask for? Earth, dirt. Give me some dirt from Israel. Why does he want dirt from Israel? Exactly. It's a way for him to take Israel with him. This is God's promised land. And if I take this dirt, it's actually not an uncommon practice. You see it in a lot of other religious documents from the time as well. But you take that, and so you have a part of that God with you. Now, it's not necessarily so superstitious, but he wants to have the presence of God with him. And you remember when God gave the law in Exodus 20 and verse 24, when they built altars, they weren't supposed to be sophisticated. If you used stones, they weren't supposed to be touched with a tool or anything. They were supposed to be natural, okay? And so it seems like he's doing that in this process. But he's saying, and he's also showing that he has been truly converted. Because he says, I'm only going to offer sacrifices to him. I'm only going to worship God. Or as the Hebrew term here is Yahweh. I mean, it's the covenant name for God. So it shows you something about his conversion. That's the second step. And then in verse 18, you see a third step, a concern that he has, that he wants to work out with Elisha. It says, in this matter, may the Lord pardon your servant when my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there. Rimmon was the god of storm and thunder in Syria. And he says, when he goes into worship there, the house of Rimmon to worship there, leaning on my arm, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, when I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. The Lord pardon your servant in this matter. He said to him, go in peace. Okay, so you remember how this whole thing starts. Who is Naaman? Politically. He's the commander. So he's a high-ranking official. And furthermore, he's important to the king, which is another designation he gets. And so what he's saying here, he's asking Elisha a question about how to handle his new conversion. Elisha, when I go in, and me and the king, most likely Ben-Hadad, the second here, when we go in and he offers his worship to this pagan god that we both worshiped from the time we were kids, and I bow down before this and he leans upon me, what he's saying is my heart really is not worshiping this image. But will God forgive me for still bowing in front of the image? That's what he's asking. And apparently Elisha says, yes, go in peace. It seems to be okay. Because he's not there in a voluntary basis. He's there because his work is forcing him there. And his heart, and he's not necessarily worshiping that God. Now, I would lie to you if I said I could answer every little nuance of this, because I can't. Because right now I'm in a class on Revelation, and one of the big things about Revelation is a refusal to put your knee down to anybody. And I don't know exactly how all of this ties together yet. But on the whole, it shows you that Naaman has been converted. It's legitimate. Why else would he worry about it? You see, conversion, it's a radical transformation even to every portion of your life. You see, some people, they're converted and Christianity basically becomes a part of who they are. It's like an add-on. It's like you already have a house that's built and you just made an addition. That's the way people view conversion. Conversion is not making an addition to our lives. Conversion is signing over ownership to Jesus and letting him come in and demolish and build back as he sees fit. That's conversion. You sign yourself over and God takes over and he does away with whatever he wants to do away with, and he builds back what he wants there. Okay? In essence, the danger is that so many people treat God like this. It's kind of like a visitor in your home, okay? So we might say in a rush that, it's been one of those weeks, we got people coming over, but it's been one of those weeks, and, the commons areas we got clean, but some of the other areas, yeah, you don't need to go in there, okay? The danger is that we do the same thing to Jesus. We allow Jesus into certain portions of our lives. But we look at other things and we say, no, he can't go in there now. He can't change how I conduct business. And he can't change habits that I already have in place. And he can't touch. And he can't honestly ask me to give certain things up. Well, listen, then there's not really conversion involved. Because conversion is wholesale. And so it's, when you look at what Naaman is doing, you see the evidence of not just a turning away from idolatry and not just a turning toward God, but fully embracing and understand that God is now going to permeate every portion of his Gentile life, which is going to be difficult for him. And he wants to understand how to navigate that and how to be faithful in that. And so he finds the answer to that question. We see him converted. Then as we keep going in verse 19, it says, "But when Naaman had gone from him a short distance, Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said, 'See, my master has spared this Naaman the Syrian, in not accepting from his hand what he brought. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him.'" So, what is Gehazi's argument before we see what he does? Wish I had my podcast cricket emoji or a button that I can hit. What is Gehazi thinking? What is his argument? He says it in this verse. What is he thinking? He makes an assessment of Elisha's action, and he makes a decision of his own. Yes, we should have at least taken something. He fundamentally disagrees with Elisha on what should happen. We should get money in return for this. We can use that money for things that are profitable. Okay, so then what does he decide to do? Go get him. He can get something from him. So why not? All right, 21. By the way, this attitude is very similar to Simon the sorcerer in Acts 8, who tries to buy the gift of the laying on of hands. Verse 21, so Gehazi followed Naaman, and when Naaman saw someone running after him, he got down from the chariot to meet him and said, is all well? He thinks maybe there's an emergency or something has happened. And he, that is Gehazi, said, all is well. My master has sent me to say. So the first few words out of his mouth are a lie. Elisha didn't send him. There have just now come to me from the hill country of Ephraim 2 young men of the sons of the prophets, this school of the prophets we talked about. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing. Okay? So he presents us a pretty legitimate story. He doesn't invent some crazy thing. Elisha is the dean of the school of the prophets. They had needs. They didn't. I went to preaching school, which are modeled after this. I get it. You're not allowed to make a lot of money. You're allowed to live, to put it generously. And so needs come up. And so what he's concocting is a plausible situation that very well could have been true. And so he asked for a talent of silver, which is a pretty significant amount of money. And Naaman says, in generosity, be pleased to accept 2 talents. Now, to kind of put this in perspective, 2 talents of silver is what Ahab's father paid for the city of Samaria. Yeah. Gehazi thinks he just retired. And he urged him, and he tied up 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 changes of clothing and laid them on 2 of his servants, and they carried them before Gehazi. So not only does Naaman give it to him, he has his servants transport it all. Because 2 talents, a talent's about 75 pounds. So you're looking at a good 150 pounds at least in these 2 talents alone. And so he has these servants deliver it for him. Verse 24, it says, when he came to the hill, he took them from their hand and put them in the house, and he sent the men away, and they departed. So he kind of gets near the house. Okay, I don't want Elisha seeing this. You guys take off now. I'll sneak it in. Now, why do you think Gehazi thinks he can get away with this? Because he actually probably has a somewhat decent reasoning behind it. Why do you think he thinks that Elisha won't know? Isn't Elisha a prophet? Yes. His greed is getting him. This is one thing we need to understand about inspired people in general. Inspired people, when they are under inspiration's influence, they don't make mistakes. But they don't always live under inspiration's influence. Let me put it this way. Paul's grocery list was not inspired, right? I'm pretty sure. Okay? Just because you spoke under inspiration doesn't even mean that you fully understood what you were saying. That's 1 Peter chapter 1. The prophets didn't understand exactly what all they were talking about. In Acts chapter 2, Peter preaches that the gospel, that whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved, and the promise is unto you and to your children and to all who are afar off, referencing Gentiles, Jews and Gentiles. But in Acts chapter 10, He has to have a vision tell him it's okay to go preach the gospel to a Gentile. He doesn't want to. So inspiration, when the person is under inspiration's influence, they don't make mistakes. But not every moment of their lives was under inspiration's influence. And so they made mistakes. Now, Elisha is a prophet, but that doesn't mean he knows everything that goes on. He's not omniscient. That would make him God. And furthermore, in the previous chapter, you remember what happened with this lady whose son had died. She comes running, and Elisha says to Gehazi, let her hear the Lord has hidden something from me. I didn't know it. And so Gehazi may think, he didn't know that. Who's to say he'll know this? He doesn't know everything. Verse 25. He went in and stood before his master, and Elisha said to him, where have you been, Gehazi? This question reminds me of a lot of questions that God will ask. It really reminds you of Genesis 3 when God asked Adam, where are you? Okay, why does God ask questions? He already knows the answer, so why does he ask them? To see if you'll tell the truth and to force you to contemplate. When he says to Adam, where are you? Adam now has to stop and think, why am I now hiding from the God I used to walk with every day? When God asks questions, they are never for information, they're always for the individual's contemplation. And further, to test the validity of their character. Will you tell me the truth or will you not? And that's what he's doing here. He's asking Gehazi. It reminds me, I have a friend who's about, I don't know, maybe 15 years older than I am, and both of his kids now are in college, and he would tell me some of these stories. His son Marshall one day, he said, I asked him, where have you been? He said, no, Brad, I knew where he was. Don't ask me how I knew where he was. I knew where he was. He said, but I wanted to know if he would tell me. Now, I'm not going to tell you how the story played out. It wasn't so good. But anyway, you're testing. Are you going to own up to it? And it also kind of makes you wonder, if Gehazi had told the truth, would his punishment have been so severe? Because I'm going to tell you, I mean, I want my kids, when they grow up, they're going to make plenty of mistakes. If they've got any of my DNA, they're going to make plenty of them. Okay? But I can promise you this. The punishment that they receive for doing wrong is always going to be less if they tell me the truth. It's always going to be less if they tell me the truth. It may still be significant, but it's not going to be what it would be if you added deception on top of what you did wrong. And so it kind of makes you wonder if if Gehazi had told the truth, maybe Elisha says, okay, just take it back. Apologize, explain it, and things will be okay. So, verse 26, or verse 25 at the end, he said, your servant went nowhere. He really sounds like a teenager, doesn't he? Where you been? Nowhere. Okay. Which is the classic answer of, I need to probe more deeply immediately, right? When they say that, nowhere. Okay, yeah. Verse 28, but he said to him, did not my heart go with you when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? I went with you. I was aware of what was going on. Now watch his question. Was it a time to accept money and garments and olive orchards and vineyards and sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants? This wasn't about money. This was about showing the power of God and communicating God to people. It wasn't a time for us to line our pockets. as if there were ever a time to line your pockets. But they can receive support for what they do in their prophetic ministry. He says, but this moment was not it. What he needed to understand was that God's grace is free. It cannot be bought. And listen, we need to be very cautious at this point. What we talked about Sunday morning about being justified freely by the grace of God, our lives that are lived in faithfulness to God after our conversion are not us paying God back for His grace. Because you can't. What our lives of faithfulness afterward are about loving and being so captivated about a God who would freely forgive us. That it was a debt that we could never pay. And so we have to be cautious that we don't think about our faithfulness to God as somehow, I've kind of earned my way back. I gave my life to preaching, so I kind of... No, you didn't. You didn't do anything. It was still all about Jesus the whole time. It was still free, and you couldn't earn it. So, in this text, what happens? The sickness of Naaman now becomes your sickness, and you'll bear that punishment and that penalty. So there's Naaman. There you see not only a Gentile outshining Israelites, but a Gentile even outshining a prophet's servant. We'll pick up, we didn't get as far as I want, but we'll pick up next week in 6 and move forward to some interesting interactions.